Hey, it's Dr. Brad with the latest in space news, and first off the bat, we're seeing a new crater caused by a rocket booster that has crashed into the moon. So back in late February and into March, a rocket booster that was uncontrolled, so this was kind of a piece of space junk, was being tracked. And it was determined that it was on a kind of collision course, an accidental intercept with the moon, and that it would impact the moon, creating a new crater. Now, it was observed to go up until the moon, and then about March 4th, it disappeared, knowing that in theory, hey, it crashed into the moon. And since that time, the NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been trying to find where this crater is. And it's now been found. Now, firstly, it's a bit of a trick to find a crater on the moon. There's a lot of craters already. So you're trying to find a haystack in a pile of haystacks, so to speak. And it wasn't ever going to leave a really big crater. So there was a lot of playing a spot the difference sort of game. And that's what we've been seeing in these images, that we have an image taken of the moon in the area before, and then one taking later when the impact has happened. And kind of the cool thing is you can see the shadows changing on different sides of the crater. This is purely due to the position of the moon and lighting from the sun, kind of just how the phases happen. So a really cool thing to see. Now, one of the surprises you may be seeing in this is there's two craters. Now, we kind of know and calculate that the booster hit within about 15 degrees of head on, and so it should have created one crater. If it would hit kind of like a side, kind of skidding on the moon, you could have believed that there would have been two craters. So why is there two and not the one as expected? And ultimately, people don't know. And this partially goes to the mystery of whose booster it belongs to. Originally, it was believed to be SpaceX, but that was then measured to say, no, we kind of know where that is. It doesn't seem to be the case. Then it turned to China, China's rocket booster. China has claimed it wasn't theirs. So we still don't really know whose booster it is. A lot of people do believe it was from a Chinese mission. And so hopefully maybe seeing two craters can help in this mystery. But what we do now know is a booster most definitely crashed into the moon, creating two new craters. Now, also just in the past few days, Virgin Orbit has celebrated their 4th launch. And if you haven't heard about Virgin Orbit, well, you should have. It is a Boeing 747 launching a rocket. It kind of doesn't get cooler than that. So the principle is that with a 747, you can still get into the air about 8 to 10 kilometers, and that reduces a lot of the energy needed to get off the ground. So you're reducing that energy the rocket needs, therefore the rate and the weight and power that this rocket needs to generate the thrust. So it saves energy, it saves costs, it saves benefits, and of course the airplane lands, so you can reuse that part and just build the second parts of the rocket. So you kind of reduce one stage, as we say, of the rocket to ease its launch. And this has now marked the 4th launch that Virgin Orbit has had, the first time they've done a night launch, because they're hoping in the future that they will be launching not just during the daytime, but the nighttime, depending on what the science or the satellites need. And so now they're headed over to the UK for their 5th launch, and this will be the first time that they're launching from the UK. So kind of a really momentous occasion for them. And it just really goes to show how different space is happening. Everyone's trying to find unique ways of reducing the cost to make it cheaper for everyone, making things reusable as possible, which again is a benefit to everyone, and doing it in a way that is the strongest at their suit. So a bunch of Boeing 747s lying around and launching a rocket to it, sign me up. And last week, NASA tested doing a very unique thing to the International Space Station, and that is using a Cygnus cargo spacecraft, something that takes new supplies to the space station, to boost the orbit of the space station. So the International Space Station slowly loses its orbit, and that's because actually at those heights, even though it's 500 plus kilometers in space, there's still a tiny amount of Earth's atmosphere which produces a tiny amount of drag, slowly reducing the orbit over time. And so every so often, the spacecraft and the space station needs a boost, just a little bit of a thruster push to push it back into its original orbit. Now, right now, Russia does most of this with their equipment and their craft. But with looking towards the future of the International Space Station, NASA and its partners want to go till 2030. Russia's only signed up till 2024, and at this point is unlikely to extend. NASA needs a plan for how to keep the spacecraft and the space station up in its original orbit. So they've tried to use a spacecraft, this cargo craft that attaches International Space Station, and then using those thrusters gives it a little bit of a boost. And it worked. So this may provide a future for keeping the space station in its orbit down the road when the Russians are no longer able to do it. And a hugely important study about the health of astronauts in space. So a study of 17 astronauts found that by spending 6 months on the space station, they get the equivalent of what an older person would have over 2 decades of bone loss. Yes, by spending 6 months in space, you lose some density in your bones, and particularly they looked at the leg bones, and this would be what you would have on Earth, but over 2 decades or so. Now this is a big deal. It's going to take at least 6 months to get to Mars, plus staying on Mars and then coming back. If you lose some bone density, get to Mars, you have weaker bones, what happens when you break a hip or something like that? That's a really hard thing to come back from, especially on a distant planet like Mars. So how this is treated, how this is mitigated is a really big deal. They found that some of the astronauts who did certain types of exercise, some lifting, were able to recover some of this loss in their bones. But in other cases, it stayed with them, meaning that they're forever going to have these weaker bones like they would if an older person over a couple of decades. So when we think about sending people to Mars and their safety and their health, this is at the forefront of issues that need to be dealt with. And the talk of the town last week was NASA's launch from the Northern Territory where I was. And last night, NASA and the Arnhem Space Centre has had their second successful launch into suborbital space, as we say. This launched a mission called Sistine, which is an ultraviolet telescope looking at our nearest star to us, Alpha Centauri. So by looking at the Alpha Centauri star in the ultraviolet colors, trying to measure the properties of the star, things like its age, temperature, composition, to help better guide what planets around it may be like, and then in the future, if we find a planet, could that star system be habitable? So a really exciting launch, and it's great to see that we're now starting to get to the cusp of regular launches from the Northern Territory. And make sure to mark your calendars for the 12th of July US time, 13th of July Australian time, when the James Webb Space Telescope will be revealing their first cool colored science image. And of course, I'll be bringing you the scoop on it here on YouTube. So make sure to subscribe to check up to date on that story and more going into the future.